Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 239, the Iron Brigade. Last time, we looked more in depth on the 1st Alabama U.S. Cavalry. This Southern-born Union regiment, I believe, is an interesting look into the mindset of such men, and I also thought their service record is a little bit interesting, as they were pretty much a mainstay in many of the major campaigns in the sub-theater of the war, especially in the latter half of the conflict. This week, we have another unit history, and I think in many ways, it is a little bit overdue. I know this is just the second episode in our unit history. Perhaps we should have been on this topic a little bit sooner. Should have done this kind of episode a little bit earlier in our run here, but here we are. This week we examine more closely the Iron Brigade. Before we dig into that, though, let's talk a little bit about our Patreon content, and of course, we will go ahead and have some episodes posted here. Recently, we did a show or a series review here. We did Manhunt, and it has some very big feelings, as they say these days, when it comes to that series. So I have that posted, and if you enjoy hearing me ramble a little bit, I'm sure that this is the episode for you. So that is posted to the Patreon. We do have other movie reviews. Recently, we've done such classics as The Outlaw Josie Wales. That is posted. We've done memoir reviews. We've done picture slideshows of modern-day battlefields. We've done other type episodes. Recently, we did a ranking of what kind of role would you like to have during the Civil War. And that was done in a more statistical type of way. So if that sounds like it would be up your alley, we have an episode that's posted there as well. Any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. Now, given last week's episode, I think it is no surprise that we have shifted in our second unit episode to a comprehensive look at the service of the Iron Brigade. The Iron Brigade is quite a popular unit, even without me mentioning them constantly, which I am aware that every time we have a battle in the East or a campaign in the East, I constantly have to tell you what the Iron Brigade is doing. I am not ignorant of that fact. They are, though, a full complement of Midwestern regiments serving in the East. Not too long ago, we commented how, at a battlefield at, say, Vicksburg, there are a lot of monuments to Midwestern regiments. This kind of makes sense, right? Because of the geography of where it is. Even at, say, a place like Chickamauga or Chattanooga, there are more of these type monuments. So having this type of unit in the East is an interesting look. They would be amongst Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, some Ohio, even New England regiments that you would usually see on these battlefields in the East. In some ways, we have the Texas Brigade being an interesting and unique look into the Army of Northern Virginia, and a good comparison in the same way that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana regiments and the Iron Brigade make up this command in the Army of the Potomac. In the future, we will actually do an episode on the Texas Brigade, and we actually have a good comparison between these two, and ironically, they do meet on the battlefield in a particularly crucial spot there at Antietam. But what else makes them particularly fascinating? Could it be their uniforms? They have the hardy-style headgear of the regular army, different than the kepis worn by most units. Uniform distinction, even in a contemporary sense, is something that sets units apart from each other. It is why we look at Zouave regiments, and believe me, we will talk about those in future episodes. But I think, too, in the name Iron Brigade, we have something to point to. They are in the thick of the fighting throughout their service, and for the most part turn in good performances. Everyone likes a winner, and a winner with a little flair. Well, that is a good combination. When we talk about the Iron Brigade, we usually begin with the 2nd Wisconsin. The reason for this is that in the early war, we see a lot of volunteer units being drawn in from various states and heading to Washington as their contribution to the war. Wisconsin at this time was still very much a frontier state, but provided one regiment and had enough to send a second. In referring to this status as a frontier regiment, we see that many of the individuals who decided to enlist come from a variety of backgrounds. A vast majority who ended up enlisting had not actually been born in the state that they represented, only recent settlers. Many were loggers, as this industry was huge in the region. A variety of immigrants also made up the troops, including many Germans, Norwegian, and Irish. They would join for the same variety of reasons that most soldiers initially joined. Many were thrill seekers in the beginning, hoping to see action and participate in a kind of adventure. There was a good amount of motivation as well, many of the troops to defend the Union, a common sentiment amongst the northern hosts. This is especially true, actually, with these Wisconsin soldiers. Many of them want to defend the Union. They want to represent their fledgling state, only recently coming into the fold of the Union, right? So that's a primary motivation, most likely more so than you would see from a abolitions kind of aspect of things. So that's more what you see with these Wisconsin soldiers. It's also interesting to note that you would see a very minimal amount of individuals who actually come from southern states who are actually going to join up and serve on the part of the Union. The 2nd would arrive in Washington. The 1st Regiment of Wisconsin soldiers participate in the Battle of Falling Waters, the early engagement with Jackson checking Patterson in the Martinsburg region. The 2nd Regiment would be part of Sherman's brigade in McDowell's army, where they would have famous company, the 69th New York Irish, the 79th New York Highlanders, and the 13th New York Rochester Regiment. Remember that Sherman's brigade is one which performs fairly well, considering how McDowell's army in general turns out. The 2nd would be engaged against Jackson's troops on Henry House Hill before being forced to withdraw. They would see some 23 or so killed with a large number wounded, fairly significant losses for the early part of the war. Much like the rest of the army, they would regroup around Centerville and begin a longer reorganization process. This would include the appointment of new officers. It gives us a good idea of how there were a lot of political officers or otherwise officers who were more concerned about adventure and seeing the elephant than actually settling into army life. Thus, there was an exodus following this first major battle. Edgar O'Connor would take the reins for the 2nd, with Lucius Fairchild, a former member of Ellsworth's Zouave militia, as lieutenant colonel. The volunteers who chose to remain around Washington would be satisfied with the more capable men at the helm. In addition, Rufus King would become brigade commander, bringing with him the 5th and 6th Wisconsin and 19th Indiana, an all-Midwestern brigade, although the 5th would be diverted to a brigade under Winfield Scott Hancock, soon to be replaced by the 7th. The 5th would go on to serve throughout the eastern theater of the war, being detached for a time to deal with the draft riots, but suffer some 329 fatalities throughout its career. King was a New York native who moved to Wisconsin in 1845, playing in the first baseball games played in the state. Lincoln had tabbed the politician to become minister to the Papal States, but King declined in favor of commanding. Eventually, he would return to the role post-war and be part of the capture of the Lincoln assassination conspirator John Surratt. Solomon Meredith commanded the 19th Indiana, imposing in his 6'7" height. Lysander Cutler, who had a failed mill operation in Massachusetts prior to the war, would be colonel of the 6th. Frank Haskell would be the adjutant, a man who eventually would write an account of the repulsive picket's charge, a still good writing of what happened on that 3rd day of July. Rufus Dawes had shown up commanding a replacement company in the same regiment. The 7th brought with it William Robinson, a veteran of the War with Mexico, having served under Zachary Taylor before mining ventures. Charles Hamilton, a grandson of Alexander Hamilton and brother to fellow federal officer Schuyler Hamilton, would also be an officer in its ranks. The brigade would winter along Arlington Heights near the home of Robert E. Lee. Even those frontier troops would show their interest in history of the area, asking about Washington and his affiliation to the home. This gives us a glimpse into the mindset of the individuals joining the ranks. If you recall, both sides used Revolutionary War inspiration to their cause. Notably, too, the Western troops were definitely a melting pot within a melting pot, so it is interesting to see them cling to this notion of being Americans, so to speak. Oftentimes we have mentioned motivation, and a big part of that being these troops was the fact that they were defending the Union, which included their recently formed state. The winter, though, would be filled with drilling, including a grand review, McClellan, of course, trying to get his army organized, some 120,000 in all, around Washington. Part of this organization process would be the addition of new uniforms, especially in the cases where some soldiers were wearing gray. The Westerners would be issued blue and Hardee-style hats as well. Fortunately for the brigade, the winter would also bring with it John Gibbon, originally commanding an attached battery. He would take over the brigade following Rufus King's ascension to division command. He shared the opinion that many regular officers held in that volunteer troops were subpar, and discipline would be the order of the day. He would take the reins once the brigade, part of McDowell's corps, arrived at Fredericksburg. Remember that McDowell would be there to check any Confederate move to the capital, and at the same time would be slated potentially by McClellan, mistakenly to join his forces as they invested Richmond. This period of time around Fredericksburg is going to be important for the brigade in general. Gibbon and Frank Haskell would work hard to drill the regiment into shape. They would additionally make the uniform the same throughout the different regiments. This would be despite some pushback from the Indiana troops. Famously, to announce their displeasure, the white stockings that the soldiers wore were placed on Gibbon's horse one day. Not only this drilling, but doing some marching would have good effect on the men. Gibbon was actually instrumental in reining in the lack of discipline that these frontier soldiers had, and famously, it's something that's almost overlooked sometimes when we talk about these regiments that come from these regions, in that they are more independent as well, right? And that kind of makes sense. You think about like the Rough Riders and their reputation when it comes to even the Spanish-American War, right? They're kind of devoid of this kind of discipline that these regular army non-volunteer units have, right? And that's kind of the appeal to them as well, where this brigade of these regiments of these guys who are already going from a state of being sort of the Wild West of their day, of their time, right? And we need to try to make them into soldiers. Well, Gibbon is going to realize that he's going to have a tough time of that already, and he's going to try to make it have this kind of concept of, we're going to humiliate these individuals who are going to fall out of line. So then it's going to be kind of a sense of honor, right? They're going to be made fun of if you're going to sort of misbehave, so to speak. And that might not be exactly the correct word, because that sounds a little bit childish, but that's kind of like what it is, right? And it's sort of the same kind of thing that you can see maybe in even a sports team or a classroom, that kind of motivation that you can see elsewhere. He's going to instill in the Iron Brigade in order to rein in this kind of ill discipline and make them into an effective fighting force. They would foray across the Rappahannock and the probing moves McDowell had before McClellan's defeat during the 7 days. They would also be involved in some picketing following the Battle of Cedar Mountain. Some of the Wisconsin troops also involved in burial detail. Additionally, some would see action after being shelled and also defending their baggage train against Confederate cavalry. Remember, Stuart had an aggressive push on Catlet's Station, one of the actions that leads Pope to sort of stall while Jackson finds himself in the rear of the Federals. So far, the Black Hats had not seen any major sustained action, but this is going to change very soon. The baptism of fire would occur at the Bronner Farm. In the previous episode, we actually read an account from Rufus Dawes describing that action in full. To put everything in context, Pope had moved his troops in an effort to catch Jackson. Now he sort of loses Jackson, which is something that is hard to imagine. But part of this thought process is that once Jackson hits his supply lines, he can capture him in a trap at Manassas Junction. One of the huge flaws in this plan, though, is that he believes the Confederate forces are simply going to wait for him to get there. As we know, the rebels had pulled into the vicinity of the railroad cut. Stonewall would hit the column of McDowell as it marched. Now, it's actually questionable as to whether Jackson actually needed to do that, but he did it anyway. Gibbon's brigade would take cover, it being thought that the artillery was only horse artillery to harass the Federals. The Black Hats would deploy to scatter or even capture the battery, but as the skirmishers wheel around the Bronner Farm, they would begin to take fire from the Confederate infantry. The 2nd would stand alone initially against the oncoming Confederate brigade. The 7th would fill in on the left and the 19th Indiana on the right. The 6th would be deployed to check Isaac Trimble and his brigade as it was thrown into the action, but a large gap would develop in the line. The two lines would become quite close, Jackson unable to coordinate a good assault on the smaller number of Union troops. Lysander Cutler would be wounded in the fighting as described by Dawes. Abner Doubleday's reinforcements would arrive in good order to shore up the position before the fighting would eventually cease. We have an account from a member of the brigade which gives us a good idea on the feeling toward the action. My legs quake so that they scarcely support my weight. Slight though it was. Should I run? Although I could hardly move one foot before the other toward the enemy. I felt that if I were to try the other way, I could beat the record. My mouth had in an instant, as it seemed, become dry and parched. I was suffering a terrible thirst. With trembling fingers, I managed to get my canteen to my lips and took a long draught. It did not quench my thirst, by which I was consumed. Again, the question presented itself to me: shall I run? I answered in the negative, because I was too much of a coward to run. I was too cowardly to endure being called a coward by my comrades if I survived. A black mass was moving out from the timber in front, directly toward us. I will not be certain, but I shall always think my hair began rising at this time. At least something lifted my hat from my head, and I had to grab it quickly, for I should have lost it. But I caught it and pulled it down tight, so it would not be liable to come off again. Just at this instant, our colonel's voice was heard giving the commands. There was not the suspicion of a tremor in his voice, while I could not, I felt sure, utter an audible sound. So there you go. You also have that kind of mindset of, I don't want to be a coward. I don't want to be called a coward. And that's, not necessarily uncommon with your other regiments within the Army, but certainly something that Gibbon has really instilled in these individuals that are in this brigade. This kind of thought process of, I can't necessarily have this hanging over my head by my comrades, right? A member of the 7th would describe the action. They rallied, brought up reinforcements, and charged our lines. And didn't they make it hot up for us? Bullets from front, at right flank, they're full of them, whistling by our ears, scratching our clothes, burning our faces. Bullets seemingly everywhere. The 6th came in on our right, 19th Indiana on the left of the 2nd, and as Battery B got into position on the little hill to our rear, firing over our heads, gave them canister, and the charge repulsed. Twice more they brought up more men and charged down upon us. Line behind line, they came, their flags flying, and were plainly heard the voice of their commander. Forward, guide center. On they grandly came, and as they got near enough, and we poured in our fire through the dim and smoky light, we saw their ranks swept down, grow thinner, and beautifully less until the last man of them seemed to drop into the ground. And yet again they came, and again their dim ranks, outlined against the sky above the hill, went out into nothingness. Darkness would bring the contest to a halt. The Iron Brigade, along with the rest of the Federals, would be pulled out to continue with their initial direction and head to Centerville, despite the contact having been made with Jackson. 725 men became casualties, or one-third of the brigade engaged, including Edgar O'Connor, hit 4 times in the fight. Gibbon, amongst others, would describe the combat as truly a stand-up fight, a very true baptism of fire. It's actually very true in that they faced the Stonewall Brigade, which was a veteran brigade at this point, and having seen your first action and being in very close, and we've commented before about this, just how close they were and trading shot for shot at super close range and being able to stand that kind of fire. And it just kind of is a testament to how disciplined that brigade was and how well drilled they were. And it is very true that it is a very tough opening fight to having been involved in. But this does not conclude the service of the brigade at the Battle of Second Manassas. We rightfully focus on the fight of the Bronner Farm, as it is the main action, the Iron Brigade being the main players on the part of the Union in that section of the fight. Often, it's even described as entirely separate from the battle itself. On the third day of the fighting, however, the Black Hats would again be deployed, this time to help them stem the tide of Longstreet's crushing flank attack. They would be on the north side of the Warrenton Turnpike. Remember, Chinn Ridge is being hit on the southern side. The 6th Wisconsin would be deployed as skirmishers and be heavily engaged with the oncoming rebels. Gibbon, amongst others, would order the killing of those who were part of the other commands fleeing the field. The rest of the brigade would again see action in defending Dogan's Ridge and a battery that was stationed there, this being on the far side of the road from the Stonehouse and Matthews Hill. Here they would repulse an attack by Evander Law's command. It would be Gibbon's command, along with Jesse Lee Reno's division, which would do the lion's share of the work to keep the Federal armies from being completely routed and possibly destroyed. Again, this would be overlooked as the third day had hotter areas of engagement, but was also important. Exactly what kind of damage the Confederates were going to have been able to do is always questionable for the third day at Second Manassas. If Jackson's troops are pretty well spent, there's always some kind of criticism that he doesn't really try at all, but exactly what they were going to do is always kind of up in the air. They probably wouldn't have been able to do a whole lot other than just kind of march after the Union troops. Even kind of a token resistance is going to be probably too much for them. And then Longstreet's command, at that point in the battle, you have most of the 9th Corps who's going to stand and fight, and then, remnants of whatever's left, including the Iron Brigade, who's going to stand, and they're going to do a good job of making sure that there's going to be no driving home of the final victory. And there's only going to be a few brigades from the Confederate Army which are going to be deployed in that final part of the action, who are going to be able to do really anything at all, and they're just going to kind of sputter out in terms of an attack there at the end. At the conclusion of the Battle of Second Manassas, we essentially transition immediately into the Antietam campaign. McClellan takes back over for the Army, Joe Hooker takes over the 1st Corps, Abner Doubleday will be division commander for the Black Hats. They will pursue Lee's army into Maryland, where they will be deployed at South Mountain. Remember that McClellan is going to have the orders in which Lee is going to outline essentially his troop strength, so with that in mind, he has a good idea of what's going to oppose him in the various gaps in the mountain. Gibbon's command will see action at Turner's Gap, deployed against Colquist Georgians of D.H. Hill's command. The Confederates, despite having a good position, would lack in numbers to properly defend the gaps, so they would be on the back foot. But with Gibbon's brigade, they would be over rugged, steep terrain, engaging with the rebels who are partially taking shelter along a stone wall. The command would steadily climb, taking fire and casualties. At one point, the 7th pinned down along the wall itself. Pressure from their own assault and the supporting Federal units in the other places on the mounted road would see Confederates withdraw, the brigade holding on to their cling to Turner's Gap until relieved. We have a report from the 6th Commander, Edward Bragg. Sir, in compliance with the circular from headquarters, I have the honor to report that at the Battle of South Mountain on the 14th instant, the 6th Wisconsin Volunteers moved up the mountain gorge to the right of the turnpike in support of the 7th Wisconsin Volunteers, who were moving in front, supporting a line of skirmishers. The skirmishers soon found the enemy in front, and an irregular fire commenced. This was past twilight. The 7th moved to support of the skirmishers and was soon engaged with the enemy, who was concealed in a wood on their left and in a ravine in front. So soon as the 7th received the fire of the enemy and commenced replying, I deployed the 6th, and with the right wing opened fire upon the enemy, concealed in the wound upon the right. I also moved the left wing by the right flank into the rear of the right wing, and commenced to fire by wings alternately, and advancing the line after each volley. At this time, I received an order from the general directing me to flank the enemy in the wood. The condition of the surface of the ground and the steepness of the ascent of the mountainside rendered this movement a difficult one, and without hesitation, the left wing moved by the flank into the wood, firing as they went, and advancing the line. I directed Major Dawes to advance the right wing of the skirt of the wood and rapidly as the line in the wood advanced, which he did. This movement forward and by the flank, I continued until the left wing rested its right on the crest of the hill, extending around the enemy in a semicircular line, and then moved the right wing into the woods so as to connect the line from the open field to the top of the hill. While this was being done, the fire of the enemy, who fought us from behind rocks and trees, and entirely under cover, was terrific. But steadily, the regiment dislodged him and kept advancing. Ammunition commenced to give out, no man having left more than 4 rounds, and many without any. It was dark, and a desperate enemy front. At this moment, I received an order from General Gibbon to cease fire and maintain the position, and the battle was won. I directed my men to reserve their fire, unless compelled to use it, and then only at short range, and trust to the bayonet. No sooner did the time of fire cease than the enemy, supposing we were checked, crept close up in the wood and commenced a rapid fire. I directed a volley in reply, and then, with 3 lusty cheers for Wisconsin, the men sat cheerfully down to await another attack. But the enemy was no more seen. I held the ground until daylight, when I threw out skirmishers and found the enemy had withdrawn in the night, leaving a few dead on the field, and a large number of muskets also. Soon after daylight, my regiment was relieved by the 2nd New York from Gorman's brigade, who had been lying in the field under cover of a stone wall, at a safe distance in the rear, refreshing themselves with a good night's sleep, after a long and fatiguing march of some 10 miles. The object accomplished and the time of place of doing it speak all that needs be said for officers and men of the regiment. Our loss was 11 killed and 79 wounded, total 90. So a couple things to unpack here, right? So the Iron Brigade's movement here at Turner's Gap against Colquitt's brigade was supposed to be a diversion. Colquitt never actually gets reinforcements, so it does sort of fail. It's part of, on a day where McClellan and his army sees a lot of success, as sort of one thing that does not go right for them. So ironically, it is sort of a failure, right? But one of the things I do want to point out, and one of the reasons why I wanted to read this particular account, is that this fire by wing concept of firing and then moving a wing over the other is actually a super complicated maneuver to conduct, even with a very well-disciplined force in the Civil War, and even in the best of terrain, even in flat terrain. So to do it in broken terrain is going to be particularly notable, and it's just going to be a testament to the discipline of this brigade, even in this very early part of their service. They've only been through one major battle at this point, but we do see just how well drilled they are to be able to perform this maneuver under fire. It would be at South Mountain where the brigade would see its name come into fruition. Now, as I have mentioned before, there were other brigades, notably a brigade of New York regiments, who were called the Iron Brigade, so the Wisconsin and Indiana troops would be given the moniker Iron Brigade of the West. Supposedly there was a conversation between Hooker and McClellan where McClellan would exclaim, "These men must be made of iron," which is where it comes from. However, the evidence is a little shaky. Regardless of the origin, the name is going to stick, contemporary sources starting to use it. Eventually, in the modern sense, we will refer to them as the Iron Brigade. The 1st Corps would pause briefly before crossing Antietam Creek on the far side of South Mountain. McClellan was convinced to act offensively yet again, being aggressive against Lee's army despite the Confederates on fairly strong defensive positions. It would be the 1st Corps who is going to kick off the action on the 17th of September. The Iron Brigade would be part of the initial movement in the northern part of the battlefield. Early on, taking artillery fire, being forced to reform at Miller's Farm before plunging into the famous cornfield. Now, the brigade is going to be moving relatively down the Hagerstown Pike, which would run into the Dunkard Church. It would be in this area where the Confederates were concentrated. The 2nd and 6th Wisconsin would be on one side of the pike, using the fence rails in part of the fighting. The 7th and 19th Indiana would be supporting the Battery B, 4th U.S. as it deployed in the face of Confederates around the church. This north part of the West Woods would be where they would be engaged. The action was described as heavy infantry work, the Midwestern units parrying away Stark's Louisiana troops and Lawton's division. It would not be without casualties, as Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Allen of the 2nd would be mortally wounded, and Bragg of the 6th would be wounded and knocked out of the action, Dawes taking his place. Advancing at the withdrawing Confederates, many would be killed and wounded, getting over the fence that lay along the Hagerstown Pike. As they emerged from the southwest corner of the cornfield, though, they would be running into a rebel counterattack led by Hood's command. Remember, the cornfield is going to change hands several times, with troops moving in a variety of directions. Remember, too, also that the cornfield is not necessarily a flat ground. That's what a lot of people think of it, when they think of the terrain at Antietam. They think of a lot of, geographically flat terrain, but it's undulating, right? So there's a lot of, especially within the cornfield, where there's a lot of kind of moving up and down. So that is also something else that we need to consider. With this heavy enemy assault, the Iron Brigade, along with some of the supporting units from Phelps' command, would fall back through the corn, rallying again on the northwest corner. The 4th U.S. Artillery was in danger of being captured by the Confederates. A desperate struggle would ensue with the Iron Brigade in the thick of it, Dawes rallying for a time, and then counterattacking the enemy, carrying the blue state of Wisconsin flag himself. Even some Wisconsin soldiers were employed with manning the guns. So close, the men of Hood's command were coming to the pieces that they were double canistered with short fuse. The 7th and 19th would both counterattack in their part of the West Woods, troops from New York also joining them. Confederates would hit them with heavy fire, forcing their withdrawal. The guns would be saved, though. The Iron Brigade reformed near the Miller farm, and then used as file closers to stop any stragglers. Antietam would continue to rage, but the battle would be over for the Midwesterners. 800 men had gone into the engagement, 340 would become casualties, some 42%. Holding the field following the battle, the burials would begin. Men would write so instantly were their comrades killed that many were frozen in the act of loading. Rufus Dawes would write, "I never want to fight there again. The flower of our regiment was slaughtered in that terrible cornfield there. I dread the thought of the place." Their raid would see some changes as they paused briefly in Maryland before moving back into Virginia. For one, Gibbon would be elevated to division command, so he would no longer be leading them. Lysander Cutler was chosen as his replacement, but he was still recovering, and Sullivan Meredith, angling for a new role, would be given the job. Additionally, another Midwestern regiment, which had been promised to the brigade, would be assigned. The 24th Michigan, under Colonel Morrow, would be joining their number. Additionally, the brigade would see the loss of a man who maybe came up with their nickname, George B. McClellan. Relieved of command, he would embark on a small farewell tour. A first-hand account describes his passing through the Iron Brigade. He already passed the 2nd and was opposite the 6th, when murmuring was heard in the 2nd. And then, if there were but one man, the old brigade sent their rousing cheers for him. He turned away, around in his saddle. I fancy I saw a tear in his eye, and slowly raised his cap. But no smile for us he used to acknowledge our cheers. No, his heart was so full of sorrow. He scanned our faces again, turned, spurred his horse, and was gone. We turned home with heavy hearts. Could hear the cheers far off brigades as he was passing. I feel as if I could never forgive our nation for the insult and foul wrong they had done that great and good man. We have just got our marching orders, and I must close to get ready. We all like Burnside next to McClellan, and he is a warm friend of McClellan. There is a bitter feeling on the army rising against the administration. So that also gives us an idea of just how well McClellan was liked amongst the troops, right? He was sort of a fan favorite, so to speak, so that's something that we also sort of need to consider. The Iron Brigade would be commanded by Meredith, as mentioned during the Battle of Fredericksburg. In this engagement, they would be deployed as part of Reynolds' division in the Prospect Hill region of the battlefield. Toward the left flank of the attacking columns under Franklin's wing, they would briefly form square as Confederate cavalry probed their position. As such, they would be subject to artillery fire and some skirmishing with Confederate infantry. Their brigade would be part of the targets for the gallant Pelham as he moved his Napoleon gun around to different positions. Casualties would be fairly light, the 24th Michigan seeing their first action and sustaining some 30-some total with less men in the other regiments. The 19th Indiana at one point was almost abandoned as Union troops withdrew back across the river, but they would be saved and joined the rest of the troops. Participating in the Mud March, the regiments would settle into winter quarters until Hooker's Chancellorsville campaign. As part of the overall movement, Hooker was in need of securing crossings over the Rappahannock to the west of the city of Fredericksburg. Remember, his flanking movements would be launched while Sedgwick's command held firm, catching Lee in a pincer movement. One crossing was Fitzhugh Crossing. The Iron Brigade task was securing a beachhead, so that the rest of the corps could cross. They would launch an amphibious assault, Confederate rifle pits on the far side. Spearheaded by the 6th and 24th Michigan, the Iron Brigade would clear the enemy, mainly with orders not to cap their muskets. Each regiment would sustain light casualties, the objective complete, allowing for Reynolds and his corps to get across the river. The Iron Brigade would not be engaged for the rest of the battle, forming as reserves to help stave off disaster for Hooker's army, defeated by Lee after 3 days of fighting. From there, Confederates would begin to march north in June 1863, making once again for Maryland and then beyond. Hooker and the army would begin to chase after Lee, marching up through familiar territory in the northern part of Virginia and Maryland, sites many had seen prior to their first two major military actions. Another famous battle was soon to take place. In a crossroads town of Gettysburg, John Buford had started to relay information back to the First Corps that there were bodies of Confederates in the area. We know that Buford understands the importance of the ground south of town, but to protect that, he needs to make a stand to the north and west. As such, his dismounted cavalry would begin to engage A.P. Hill's command on the 1st of July. The First Corps would be marching with the Iron Brigade, unfurling their colors, the regimental band of the 6th striking up the Campbells Are Coming, Rufus Dawes commanding for Bragg, who was injured, thinking it would be a boost to the morale of the people of Pennsylvania. Reynolds had made a decision that is one of the more famous questions we can ask prior to Gettysburg. One theory is that he wishes to fight on the soil of his native state. The entire 1st Division of the 1st Corps would thus be the 1st Infantry of the Army of the Potomac engaged. Senator Cutler was commanding the 2nd Brigade of the division and would start to deploy to the west of town. It was in this area, past the Lutheran Seminary, where the battle was beginning in earnest. Archer's mixed brigade of Confederates and Joseph Davis's mostly Mississippi Brigade was moving to gain key pieces of ground on McPherson's Ridge, moving through a copse of woods past Willoughby Run. Reynolds could see the issue and had hustled in the Iron Brigade, the 2nd leading the way in echelon. The 7th, 19th, and 24th would be in line behind them, the 6th in reserve. Not only was the high ground important, but the Tennessee and Alabama troops were flanking Cutler, whose command straddled the Chambersburg Pike. The 2nd taking casualties, they would reach the copse of woods. This is where Reynolds was hit in the back of the head and mortally wounded, supposedly as he turned to give commands. The 24th Michigan would find itself overlapping the Confederate line, able to cause much havoc in the Confederates. The Southerners had originally suspected that they might be facing just only cavalry and militia, but the arrival of the damned Big Hat Devils would be a proper signal for a fight. Fierce fighting would develop in the woods, the Confederates surrendering when pressed. The 2nd would actually pursue the rebels for some distance, the momentum of their charge carrying them forward, even despite the loss of their colonel Lucius Fairchild. Pat Mahoney of the 2nd Wisconsin would be killed in the fighting, but not before apprehending Archer himself and taking him prisoner. As the Confederates of the command were reeling, the 6th was ordered to halt, Doubleday taking command of the corps. Cutler was in trouble. Davis had driven in parts of his command. From a position in a railroad cut, they would do damage on the enemy line. Really, the steep banks of the cut were much like those at 2nd Manassas, and it was only in their flanking attempt on the ground before the cut that the true danger lay. Dawes would launch his 6th Wisconsin across the field, taking 50% casualties as a result. The 95th New York and 14th Brooklyn of Cutler's Breaking Brigade would also partake in the action. Some 225 Confederates were forced to surrender, the flag of the 2nd Mississippi taken in the charge. Dawes had a full account of the charge, which we actually read in our Gettysburg episodes. For the Iron Brigade, though, the day was not yet done. Famously, they would remain in the McPherson Ridge line as the Confederate pressure began to mount. The 24th Michigan would find themselves in a duel with the 26th North Carolina, both regiments taking heavy casualties. Solomon Meredith would be wounded in the action, brigade command falling to John Robinson of the 7th Wisconsin. Henry Morrow of the 24th would also be forced to relinquish command. Confederate regiments late in the afternoon, and the events that had befallen the 11th Corps north of town would see the Union defensive line withdraw through Gettysburg itself towards Cemetery Hill. Winfield Scott Hancock would wish to extend the Union position, especially as Ewell continued to form up his men before the fresh high ground. As the Midwesterners set up their line near Culp's Hill, they took stock of the day's fight. 1,883 men had marched into the action, 691 remained to answer the roll. Strewn on McPherson Ridge, with many wounded in the Lutheran Seminary, the Iron Brigade's hard fight had been part of stemming the Confederate tide. The 24th Michigan suffered 80% casualties, a staggering number. On the second day of the battle, the 6th Wisconsin and 14th Brooklyn would be employed to help hold the lines of George Sears Green, engaged only briefly. The Iron Brigade would remain in line, while the Confederates launched their attack on the third day, but they would be lightly engaged. We have the 6th Wisconsin as one of the regiments with the distinction of having fought all 3 days at Gettysburg. As the brigade made its way back into Virginia, the toll of the fighting in relatively only a year was telling. They would receive a new song, the Step of the Iron Brigade, and a new brigade flag. There would be a question, though, of whether the Midwestern units should be constituted into a veteran unit or not. Many of the regiments returned a majority of re-enlistments as veterans who received a sort of sign-on bonus. They would also receive, as a benefit, a 30-day furlough. Many took full advantage, including Rufus Dawes, who was married during this time. Lysander Cutler would take back over the brigade as Solomon Meredith was recovering from wounds received at Gettysburg. In fact, he would actually no longer be in field command following these wounds that he receives. The command would be part of the consolidation of corps, the first being no more. No, they would be part of the 5th Corps, James Wadsworth taking over division command. Ulysses S. Grant would be the new leader in the East, and with him, more action. Bounty men and replacement recruits would be added into the ranks, the 7th Indiana, a new regiment for the Iron Brigade as well. They would see action in May at the Wilderness on both days. The first day, they would be involved in attacks south of Saundersfield against Ewell's Corps. The Iron Brigade would be part of a minor breakthrough, so minor that some accounts vary greatly as to whether it could be called a breakthrough at all. And we talked about this actually in the Wilderness battle that we did in the narrative, in that there is this replacement regiment of Confederate troops, or a rookie regiment, really, that doesn't see a whole lot of action, that kind of breaks, and then there's kind of a scattering of Iron Brigade troops that find themselves sort of behind Confederate lines, but kind of speaks to the confusion of the battle itself and the terrain, in that there's kind of like a confusion as to how far they were behind lines, right? Who actually realizes that they're behind Confederate lines, whether it's just them or the officers. I've seen a lot of different accounts, and like, it's even in the contemporary, there's not really a whole lot about it too. This is more of a modern day, more a different look, I think, and some histories just kind of exclude it entirely, as I mentioned. The following day, they would be used to support Hancock and his men as they pressed their advantage. Longstreet's troops would arrive, and in a furious counterattack, the Iron Brigade would be thrown back yet again. 724 men would become casualties, leaving a brigade with only some 700. William Robinson would lead a brigade at Spotsylvania, the Midwesterners being part of Warren's line around Laurel Hill, where they would run into Jeb Stuart's cavalry and then Anderson's command. They would launch some ineffectual assaults, remember Warren being threatened almost by Humphrey to launch these attacks. Part of the Iron Brigade would be dispatched to support Hancock and his assaults on the Muleshoe. Following the battle, the 2nd Wisconsin would be removed from the brigade, the 1st regiment to see action, also the first to be put to pasture, so to speak, having seen heavy action. Robinson would be victimized at Jericho Mills during the Battle of North Anna, Confederates attacking and flanking the Iron Brigade, putting them to flight as they crossed the river. Only artillery and the timely arrival of reinforcements would save them, and probably Warren's entire 5th Corps from being rolled up. The brigade would continue through the overland campaign, being part of minor efforts at Cold Harbor, and then settling in along the lines at Petersburg. Edward Bragg would take over command of the brigade, Robinson leaving the army, and Dawes also being mustered out. They would participate in some of the 5th Corps actions around the Weldon Railroad on the left flank of the Federal lines. They would be part of the check of Nathaniel Harris's Mississippi Brigade. During one of the actions, Billy Mahone smashes the Federals. The 6th and 7th of Wisconsin to remain into 1865 in the 5th Corps, the 24th Michigan being sent to Illinois, forming the honor guard for President Lincoln post-assassination. The Badgers would be victimized at Gravelly Run and forced to withdraw in the action that included the Federals trying to flank the Confederates. They would follow up this action with a mop-up on the lines at Five Forks. From there, the Badgers would march to Appomattox, eventually mustering out later in the summer. Thus, the service of the Iron Brigade would come to a close. 14.7% of those who served in the brigade would be killed or mortally wounded. 2,000 more out of the total of approximately 7,000 would be wounded. In conclusion, we can see that the Iron Brigade had a storied service much deserving of the rundown that we have here today. It's a little surprising to note that the major battles they participate in with a meaningful impact occur all really in less than a year. Second Manassas, Antietam, Gettysburg, they all play major roles. It's actually interesting if you have the book that Alan Nolan writes. It's one of the more famous accounts of the Iron Brigade. It kind of just ends after Gettysburg, right? Which is sort of funny because it kind of has this build up and then Gettysburg happens and then, it's over. But we know that the Iron Brigade continues after Gettysburg. There's more to the story. But you see how the decline of the brigade happens, and you know that they don't have as big an impact on the field after that because they're just so depleted at that point. And you could probably argue that the Wilderness, they do have a decent performance. You could probably argue that they continue to have okay performances here. Certainly not at Jericho Mills. Nobody really does have an okay performance at Jericho Mills, at least in my opinion, for the 5th Corps. It certainly is one of those what-if situations where it's a what-if certainly for Warren, where he might have been fired a little bit sooner, in my opinion. But you certainly have that kind of mindset where you have these Second Manassas, Antietam, Gettysburg. These happen so quickly in terms of their history. And had they been a little bit more involved, had there not been this kind of mindset that there could be a flanking attack on Franklin's wing there at Fredericksburg, maybe they would have been more heavily engaged at Fredericksburg. Who knows? So it could have been even more so in a row. And I know Chancellorsville is also in there as well, but you could have had 4 in a row maybe, where you had them play a more major role. So it is interesting, I think, also to think not only that they have this kind of aura about them, but it's not quite the same as, say, the Texas Brigade. And I know I mentioned them kind of at the top and how we would compare them just a little bit. But the Texas Brigade is there from start to finish, essentially, for the Army of Northern Virginia. And we'll get into that when we get to their episode here in the future. And certainly we'll kind of talk about that when we compare the other way, right? But they're there for the entirety of the war, and that's the same with most Confederate units, right? They don't leave, they have to be there from the beginning, essentially, due to the kind of the manpower disadvantage that the Confederates have, whereas the Iron Brigade joins a little bit later and they leave a little bit earlier. And that's not to say that their service is any less significant, right? And that's not to say that their casualties don't mean as much. And so that's also the interesting thing, I think, with the Iron Brigade and the impact that they make on these battles. Do they always have the best performances? Certainly not in the latter half of their career, but we can point to a couple of instances where they have the biggest of impacts. And I think Gettysburg, 100%. We can say that the first day of Gettysburg, if the Iron Brigade doesn't perform as well as they do, then that battle is very different. Antietam is definitely one where, certainly the cornfield does change hands several times, but they do excellent service in the cornfield. That portion of the field probably is a little bit different had they not been there as well. So you can point to those two situations and you can say these are very different had they not been present. Are these the best units of the East? That is a question that has popped into my mind. It's a question that's been around, perhaps. If they are not, then we certainly have them in the conversation. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Post it in the description. Should be a link to the website as well as Patreon. Support for the general upkeep of the show would be greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.